Marriage, a word covered in wedding flowers, white dresses and vows that sound sacred. But it is also the same word that once imprisoned millions of girls in the name of honour. It once turned the wedding night into a ritual of blood. It was once used as a legal seal to frame coercion, injustice, and silence. In today's episode, we will go back to the Middle Ages, a period spanning nearly a millennium, to revisit a truth once hidden behind grand weddings. That marriage for centuries was not about two people in love, but about power, property, lineage, and virginity, where the ring not only symbolised commitment but also determination, where the woman was not just a bride but also a prize, a hostage, a detail in a contract. This will not be an easy journey, but it is very necessary, because only when we understand how marriage was once defined can we ask the question, today should the remnants of that definition continue to exist? In 1455 in England, a 12-year-old child was led into the bridal chamber, amidst the prayers of her family, the murmuring congratulations of her relatives and her own silence. That child was named Margaret Beaufort, the daughter of a distinguished nobleman, and a wedding gift from one powerful family to another. No one asked Margaret if she agreed. No one thought she could refuse. She had menstruated, and that was enough. And that night the bed became a courtroom. The white sheet was brought out the next morning not to be changed, but to be displayed in the courtyard where men awaited a bloodstain. That bloodstain not only proved the bride's virginity, but also confirmed the successful exchange. One family preserved its honour, another family gained an heir. A little girl became proof. In that world, marriage did not require love, it required legitimacy. The medieval nobility called that night the Night of Nights, a night anticipated, prepared for disgust. But for many girls it was the first night they knew fear of men, and not fear because the man was evil, but because he was allowed to do so by law, the church family and history. Why 12 years old? Because according to the canon law of that time, that was the age at which a girl was considered old enough to marry. No need to understand her body, no need to understand life. Just having menstruation, a biological sign used as a legal boundary. As if a little girl who started bleeding had become a legal wife. One might say that was a matter of the past, of a culture long gone. But has it really gone far when today in many parts of the world child marriage still occurs every day? When 13 and 14-year-old girls are still forced into marriage to save family face? When the word virginity is still a criterion for evaluating a woman, and virgin is still an unspoken condition for a marriage to be recognised? We may have replaced red wedding dresses with white ones, but are we sure that the fear of young brides has truly changed colour? Geoffrey Chaucer, the 14th century English poet, once wrote in the Canterbury Tales a line that was both bitter and cruelly accurate: "Marriage is a misery and a woe. Marriage is misery and sorrow. Not everyone suffers. But for those who cannot choose, cannot speak, cannot back down, marriage is not a beginning, but a sentence." That is not Margaret's story alone. It is the story of millions of girls who lived, died, and were forgotten after a bustling ceremony. And that is also why we need to go back to the beginning. To see that before love was invited into marriage, there was a time when silence and blood were two prerequisites. And if today we still remain silent when a girl is forced into marriage, still avoid, when our children ask about the right to choose, still implicitly place honour heavily on the bodies of others, then how are we any different from those who held up a bedsheet the next morning and called it pride? And if Margaret had to endure an arranged marriage with her virginity as dowry, then the following girl will show you another form of dowry, with a greater meaning representing an entire kingdom. Eleanor of Aquitaine did not marry for love, she married for a map. In 1137, when Eleanor was only 15, she was married to Louis XIII, King of France. But she did not come to the wedding empty-handed. She came with an entire territory. Aquitaine, vast wealthy, located in southern France, officially became her dowry. That is, it became a wedding gift, not for Eleanor but for Louis. And people called that marriage. The word dowry in the medieval world was not just money. It was land castles, ruling rights. Dowry was what turned a girl into a political bargain, what formed alliances and extended dynasties. At aristocratic weddings, the most important gift was not in the bride's hands, but in the wooden chest escorted by soldiers behind. For common people, dowry was a few plots of land, a cow, a carved wooden bed. For the wealthy, it was gold ingots, jewellery, slaves. For royalty, dowry was an entire territory, and if the marriage broke down, those dowries could become reasons for war. Eleanor and Louis divorced after 15 years of marriage, and the first question was not who was right or wrong, but will Aquitaine be returned? Because in that marriage, Eleanor was not just a wife, she was a bargaining chip. This story is not an exception. It is a principle. For centuries, to get a good wife, a man needed to look at the value brought from the bride's family. A good marriage was a profitable transaction, and a good girl was an accompanying asset package. If you find that strange, try to recall the questions people often ask when they hear someone is about to get married. Is her family well off? What does he do for a living? Does he own a house? Yet, after marriage, will they live with parents or on their own? Who pays for the wedding? These questions may have changed from land to apartments, from cattle to salary, but the essence is still an appraisal. We no longer call it dowry, but we still care about what each person brings into the marriage. And if they bring nothing, then is it worth marrying? That is not an isolated thought. It is a remnant of a culture that once viewed marriage as an amalgamation of assets. And what is more painful is that the person asked what they bring does not always have the right to appraise themselves. Francesco d'Attini, a 14th century Italian merchant, left over 500 letters and marriage contracts detailing dowry amounts, how many silver coins, how many acres of land, how many dresses, and even penalty clauses if the wedding was cancelled. For him, marriage was a transaction, and for many love was just an added detail if they were lucky enough to have it. But not all dowries take the form of land or gold and silver. In some places, dowry is a guarantee for the right to be respected, if not the right to exist. In 13th century Iceland, in the ancient law code Gragas, also known as the Grey Goose Laws, there existed a form of bride price called munda. This was not just ordinary wedding money. Munda was an amount that the groom's family had to pay the bride as an acknowledgement of her status and rights in the new family. And more importantly, if the bride was abused, beaten, or abandoned, the munda had to be refunded as a silent form of insurance for the woman's body and dignity. In a world without divorce, laws, without emergency hotlines, without organisations supporting victims of domestic violence, munda was the only thing that bound a man to consider the consequences before raising his hand. In Eastern Europe, the custom of callum, an ancient form of bride price, also carried a similar nuance. Although the material value was not great, but callum is a symbolic ritual, performed publicly demonstrating the respect and approval of both families. In many communities, callum cannot be ignored because if it is, the marriage will be considered illegitimate and the woman will have no status in her husband's home. That is the only bright side of the bride price when it is used as a commitment of responsibility. But in most cases, it is just a default measure to determine whether a woman is worth marrying. And the higher the price, the lower the girl's right to choose. Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Catholic theologian and philosopher, pondered this issue extensively. In his works, he wrote that the bride price, if misunderstood, could turn marriage into a transaction of buying and selling people. He asserted that a man should not pay to acquire a wife as if buying a slave. The bride price, if any, should only be an expression of goodwill and a commitment from the heart. But his words did not become law. They remained only in books, because the system was accustomed to operating by property, by bloodline, and by power. As for the heart, if any, it was merely a minor detail. Francesco d'Attini, a 14th century Italian merchant, left a huge archive of documents about marriages of that era. In the engagement contracts he wrote or witnessed, every detail was clearly recorded: how many silver coins, how many acres of land, how many wedding dresses, and if the bride cancelled the wedding before the ceremony, who had to compensate whom. A contract sometimes longer than love letters, but absolutely no room for emotions. The remarkable thing is, even in such detailed documents, there was no line asking if the bride agreed to marry. They only asked if the dowry had been delivered, if the commitment had been signed, and if the penalty had been fully calculated. Therefore, when we stand in a wedding ceremony today hearing the officiant ask, "Do you agree to marry this person?" we might think it's obvious. But in reality, that question is a privilege. It is the result of centuries when people never asked. And today, when that question is asked, it is also important to remember that not everyone has the right to answer. In many places, the bride price still exists. It is no longer called munda, not called callum, not signed with red ink. It is in the betrothal money that the bride's family sets to test the groom's family's worthiness. It is in the saying, "If you marry a Saigon man, your family must have a car," or "If you marry my daughter, you must prepare a proper ceremony." People say it's a custom, it's culture, it's a way of showing respect. But if that respect comes with pressure, with debt, with valuation, then is it still respect? Because in the end, when people still count wedding dresses, count gold, count job positions, count land deeds, even if unspoken, they are still asking, is she, is he, worth marrying? And if marriage begins with a price list, where will love stand? Perhaps we no longer call it a dowry, But as long as women still have to prove they are worthy of being married, then the shadow of the 1,000-year-old contract still looms over today's wedding. Today we know how to love before marriage. But how many people get married and then realise that their marriage is still being run by the questions of the 13th century? What does she have? What does he have? Who can give more? In a world where everything is valued from house's rings to the number of guests, the most terrifying question is not who loves whom more, but who is worth more. But not every royal marriage is for expanding the map. Some marriages are arranged simply to maintain the bloodline. Inbreeding, once considered taboo among common folk, was seen as a strategy among the nobility. Brother married cousin, sister married half-brother, girl married her maternal uncle. And the reason was very simple to keep property power and status within a closed circle. The Habsburgs are the most famous example. For generations they intermarried, married repeatedly, married within the same bloodline to the point of creating a distorted genetic map. The result? Successors with deformed faces, rare diseases, bones as brittle as crystal, and minds submerged in a neurological fog. Charles II of Spain, the final product of this chain of inbred marriages, was born unable to eat, without choking, unable to speak coherently, and never had children. When he died, the bloodline, once protected by centuries of inbreeding, became extinct. That was the tragedy of those who wanted to hold on to power down to the cellular level. And that was also the bitter limit of a mindset that turned marriage into a tool of biological control. People still thought love could overcome all boundaries. But marriage in history was sometimes where boundaries were deliberately erected to prevent power from leaking out, even at the cost of life itself. To marry is a beautiful word, but it does not mean to love. In the Middle Ages, love and marriage often lived in two separate worlds. They rarely met, and if they did, it was often in secret. People called it courtly love. A kind of love that did not belong to the law, did not lead to marriage, and was not allowed to end with a wedding. It was the love of knights for married ladies. A kind of love celebrated in literature and music and ballads, filled with longing that could never be touched. William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, was one of the first to write about such love. He loved but did not marry. He yearned but was not acknowledged. And the verses he left behind are an emotional map of an era that did not allow the heart to decide marriage. In the 12th century, the tragic story of Tristan and Isolde became iconic. A hero and a princess. They loved each other deeply, but she was promised to another. They met in secret nights, loved each other as if each moment was the last, and then were separated by the very people who had raised a toast to her wedding. Their love was not wrong, but it was in the wrong place. There is no moral lesson here. Only a truth marriage, then, did not require love, and love, if it existed, had to live on the sidelines. Dante also loved in this way. Beatrice, the woman he briefly met as a child, became the soul of his entire poetic world. Dante loved her from afar without a single date. When she died, he continued to write for her. Love as a form of worship, as a kind of prayer. In La Vita Nuova, he wrote, "Love and a gentle heart are one." A simple statement, but precisely because it was simple. It was all the more alien to the marriages of that time where the heart had no voice, and gentleness was not placed in love but in submission. You might think that was a matter for the nobility, that common people would be more practical, would love first and then marry. But that was not always the case. For most commoners, marriage was still a family decision, and love was still a luxury. The only difference was that when they quietly liked each other, they might be allowed to be together as long as both parents agreed. Love then was like a seed secretly growing in the backyard. If lucky, it would grow, take root, and blossom. Otherwise it would be pulled out before anyone could see it. In the ancient documents that remain, there are many stories of young couples who knew each other from childhood, were betrothed early, then grew up together and fell in love without realizing it. These loves were not written into poems, not given names, but they were warm and enduring. Such love was not soaring, but as strong as a house that knows how to withstand the rain. So we see love was not absent. It just wasn't invited to the wedding. It came later or too early. It came where no one noticed, then was pushed away by calculations greater than the heart. And today, is it true that every marriage is built on love? Is it true that all weddings are the result of two people choosing each other? Or are there still banquets arranged because people have reached a certain age, are eligible, can't wait any longer? Perhaps love is no longer forbidden. But that doesn't mean it has truly been invited to sit in the main seat. When love is not invited to the wedding, the other person must enter with something else. Duty. In the medieval world, marriage was not about two people choosing each other. It was about two families, two lineages, two powers, or two purses deciding to pair up. and once married, both individuals had to accept their roles as if it were a given. No questioning, no delaying, no backing down. The church clearly defined girls could marry from 12-year-old boys from 14. No one asked what the child knew about themselves. As long as they were of legal age, they were considered to have duties, and the first duty was to obey. For centuries, the law of coverture in England stipulated that when a woman married, she completely lost her independent legal status. She could not own property, could not sign documents, could not appear in court as an individual. All her rights dissolved into her husband, and not in a romantic sense, but in an administrative sense. In other words, getting married meant erasing oneself before the law. And at home, women were expected to bear children, raise them, care for them, and maintain order. That was a list of duties packaged in the phrase heavenly calling. It sounded like a gift, but in reality it was a job description with no pay, no leave, no choice. Peter Abelard, a 12th century French philosopher who passionately loved his student Heloise and suffered a painful price for that love, once wrote a very true sentence. The burden of marriage is great and should not be placed on the necks of children. But society didn't listen, because it didn't need children to understand it, only needed children to obey. And when that child grew up, they continued to pass on that pattern to the next generation, because that's what they themselves were taught was normal. In the 14th century, Lady Agnes Randolph, a Scottish noblewoman, single-handedly commanded the defence of Dunbar Castle when her husband was absent. The English army attacked, food ran out, but she did not retreat, did not surrender. And it was she, a wife, who forced the enemy to retreat in shame. History calls her Black Agnes, a woman who not only fulfilled her duty but dared to redefine it. But Agnes was an exception. Most women had no castle to defend, no soldiers to command, no right to refuse. They only had the kitchen, the cradle, and the scrutinising gaze of their mother-in-law neighbours and the church. And if they didn't fulfil their duty, they were called selfish, failures, unable to keep their husband, making their children suffer. We often say that today women have more rights, and that is true. But the question is not about legal rights, but about the structure of thinking. How many girls marry because they feel it's time? How many mothers advise their daughters to bear a little for the sake of peace at home? How many women feel they must sacrifice, must be silent, must preserve because that is a wife's duty? And if a relationship is maintained only out of duty, is it still a bond? Or is it just a social contract that those involved dare not unilaterally cancel? Once love is replaced by a role, people no longer live authentically with each other. They live like characters given pre-written lines. The wife must be gentle, the husband must provide, the child must be obedient, and if one of them gets tired, the entire script collapses. Society may have changed, but the roles remain. And perhaps it's time to ask ourselves, if I don't want to play this role anymore, am I allowed to leave the stage? But even when the role becomes suffocating, it's not easy to step off the stage, because with marriage, leaving has never been encouraged, and for centuries it was almost forbidden. The medieval church considered marriage a sacrament. Once formed, it is eternal. Divorce in the modern sense simply does not exist. Feelings can die, trust can be lost, violence can occur, but the bond remains. There were only two exits, and both were narrow. One was annulment, meaning declaring the marriage invalid from the start. The other was divorcium, meaning being allowed to live separately, but not to remarry, not to start over. The most famous case was the marriage between King Louis VII and Eleanor of Aquitaine. They were married for 15 years. There was no son. And the reason for the annulment recorded in historical texts was because they were close relatives, a valid excuse in terms of canon law. But the truth it was that they no longer chose each other, but instead of calling it a breakup, people called it a technical error. After the annulment, Eleanor kept her lands, and soon after she remarried Henry Plantagenet, who later became King of England. A new marriage was formed, a map of power was rearranged, and a woman who had just left her old marriage became queen for the second time. But Eleanor was an exception. The rest of the world had no land to bring, no relative reason to cling to, no bargaining power. They just felt stuck. Gratian, a 12th century jurist, once wrote in Decretum Gratiani, "A man is not permitted to abandon his wife unless she commits adultery." That sounds moral, but it also means that if she is beaten, abused, or emotionally betrayed, she still has to stay, because there is not enough reason. Meanwhile, a man could remarry as long as he obtained a decree of annulment from the church. This created a world where women's endurance was seen as a sign of virtue, while withdrawal was seen as a moral failure. Another often forgotten case is Emma of Normandy, wife of King Ethelred. She did not divorce. She simply quietly left England, returned to Normandy, and lived the rest of her life beyond her husband's reach. No one punished her. But no one named that action either. It was not a right. It was just a loophole. Today, we have the right to divorce. But the guilt of leaving a marriage remains. Some people don't leave not because they are still in love, but because they don't want to be called a breaker. Some people continue to endure not because they don't feel pain, but because they don't believe they have the right to end it. Because from a young age they were taught how to preserve, how to endure, how to for the children, how to just live through it. But no one taught them how to leave. And when no one teaches us how to leave, even if the door is open, we still sit in the room of suffering and call it fate. Perhaps what needs to be abolished is not just a marriage, but the idea that a person is only valuable when they stay. We have passed through many doors. Some opened to the wedding chamber of a 12-year-old child. Some led to a rearranged map of Europe due to a dowry. Some closed to love to make way for duty. And some only opened a little, then closed for those who wanted to leave but did not have enough reason. Now, standing at the end of this journey, we need to look back from the beginning, not to recount, but to re-ask the question. If marriage was once defined as a political contract, if love was once excluded from the altar, if women were once erased from the law when they entered marriage, if endurance was once called virtue, then today have those ideas truly disappeared? We talk about medieval marriage as if it were a closed chapter. But how many fragments of that chapter are still mixed in today's stories? How many girls are still asked, when will you get married, before being asked, how do you want to live? How many men still have to play the role of pillar even though they are the ones silently breaking down? And how many marriages still begin with conditions, reputation, assets, pressure, without ever being asked a simple question, do you two truly choose each other? Perhaps we have changed wedding dresses from red to white, changed wedding parties from village communal houses to hotels, changed dowries from land to credit contracts. But if the essence remains valuation, coercion, and pre-assigned roles, then perhaps the only thing that changes is the stage. And if so, perhaps what we need to change most is not the ritual but the definition. Marriage does not have to be the destination. It does not have to be a certificate of maturity. It is not a requirement to prove that we have succeeded, are stable, or have lived up to expectations. And above all, it should not be a place where people lose themselves just to maintain the image of a family. A person can love deeply, live, devotedly commit, nurture, build, and sacrifice without needing to walk down the aisle. Just as some can marry, grandly sign all the papers, and have a lavish ceremony without truly choosing each other. Shakespeare once wrote in a famous comedy, "The course of true love never did run smooth." But if that path is already rugged, then marriage without love only makes it more thorny. And no one should be forced to walk that path alone just because people say, just try a little harder. Marriage, if it is to survive, needs to be redefined, not by law, but by human dignity. Not by traditional heritage, but by willingness and truthfulness. And if not, then we have the right to call it by another name, or not call it anything at all. Because in the end, what matters is not who you married, but whether you can live true to yourself in that life. Good night, and see you in the next podcast episode.